Society often assumes that when every single paper asset is stripped away, a human being is successfully erased. They believe that poverty is a permanent stain, a sudden deletion of existence. But they forget a fundamental truth. The greatest legacies in this world have never resided in the lifeless, silent digits of a bank account. True power does not evaporate when the ink dries on a divorce decree. Dorothea Calloway, known to the few who still mattered as Dot, was 68 years old. For 32 long years, she had been the unseen, tireless architect of a man's towering success. She had ironed the crisp white shirts, balanced the early ledgers at the kitchen table late into the night, and smiled pleasantly at endless corporate dinners while her husband soaked in the applause. She had built the very foundation upon which his grand empire stood. Arthur Calloway was a man of impeccable presentation. He wore perfectly tailored navy suits. He favored regimental striped ties that spoke of old money and ruthless ambition. He was also completely, utterly cold-blooded. The dismantling of her life was not an act of sudden passion or explosive anger. It was a calculated, meticulously executed corporate restructuring. Arthur had spent exactly 18 months secretly and legally liquidating their shared world. He moved massive funds through offshore trusts, transferred property titles to anonymous shell companies, and quietly rewrote the narrative of their shared wealth until her name was nowhere to be found. He weaponized the law with surgical precision. When the final papers were served, there was no grand argument in the expansive foyer of their mansion. There were no shattered porcelain plates, no desperate pleas, and absolutely no hysterical screams echoing through the high ceilings. Dorothea read the documents in absolute silence. She looked at the man she had served for over 3 decades, searching his perfectly shaved face for a single flicker of remorse. There was nothing. Arthur had pushed her out into the cold with an old, rusted sedan, a single leather suitcase containing a few personal items, and exactly $21,000. It was an insulting fraction of the massive financial empire she had helped build from the ground up. It was a sum designed not to sustain her, but to humiliate her entirely. It was a calculated message from a man who believed he held all the cards. A lesser woman might have fallen to her knees in despair. A weaker soul might have spent those meager thousands on a desperate legal retaliation, feeding the last of her dignity to ravenous attorneys who promised revenge but delivered only bills. Dorothea did neither. She did not shed a single tear. She simply packed her suitcase. She locked the heavy oak door of the grand estate for the final time, walked down the long driveway, and drove away. She drove hundreds of miles south, leaving the gleaming city skyline behind her, watching the temperature gauge on the dashboard climb to a sweltering 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 weeks later, she found herself deep in the fictional county of Willow Creek, South Carolina. The humidity hung thick and heavy in the air, wrapping around the towering oak trees and the Spanish moss that swayed softly like tattered lace in the warm breeze. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and forgotten history. Dorothea stood on a cracked concrete sidewalk, looking up at a decaying structure that the rest of the world had completely abandoned. It was an old restaurant, shuttered and left to rot for 8 long years. The paint was peeling off the wooden siding in long, brittle strips that fluttered weakly in the wind. The windows were completely opaque, caked with thick layers of grime, dirt, and neglected time. The front porch sagged dangerously, the wooden floorboards warped and splintered by countless seasons of harsh summer sun and driving rain. It was a piece of garbage real estate. Nobody wanted it. The town had written the property off as a miserable eyesore, a lost cause occupying nearly 2 acres of overgrown weeds, destined only for the crushing weight of a demolition bulldozer. Dorothea took the insulting severance her husband had thrown at her, the $21,000, and she used nearly every single penny of it to buy this rotting corpse of a building. It was a transaction that baffled the few locals who witnessed the signing of the deed. They whispered behind her back. They thought she was a crazy, broken old woman throwing her last desperate lifeline into a rapidly sinking ship. They did not understand the quiet strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Dorothea stood before the rusted iron handles of the front doors, her posture perfectly straight, her hands weathered but remarkably steady. She breathed in the heavy scent of damp wood, rust, and absolute silence. The metal handles were rough beneath her palms, stained with years of bitter neglect. Standing before the decaying facade of this discarded property, Dorothea had absolutely no idea that beneath the thick layers of dust and 8 years of dead silence lay something with the power to completely flip the chessboard of her life.
The rusted iron hinges shrieked in violent protest as Dorothea pushed the heavy front doors inward. The air inside was immediately suffocating, a toxic blend of rotting pine timber, stagnant rainwater, feral animal decay, and the heavy stench of 8 years of total isolation. She stepped over a pile of shattered window glass, her scuffed leather shoes crunching softly against the debris. The darkness was absolute. The only illumination came from a few jagged holes in the boarded-up windows, cutting through the swirling dust like pale, ghostly daggers. She stood perfectly still. This was her rock bottom. It was a sprawling 4,000-square-foot monument to absolute failure and structural decay. Arthur would have sneered at the pathetic sight, adjusting his pure silk tie while calculating the exact cost of the heavy bulldozer required to flatten this miserable eyesore. He absolutely despised dirt. He had spent his entire life sanitizing his wealth, aggressively hiding his ruthless betrayals behind perfectly manicured fingernails and the incredibly expensive cologne he imported from Paris. Dorothea did not sneer. She reached deep into the faded pocket of her cotton dress and pulled out a small wire-bound notebook and a dull yellow pencil. The emotional storm raging inside her chest was a violently destructive hurricane, a chaotic vortex of profound betrayal and the terrifying reality of having no financial safety net left. But she forced that massive storm down into the deepest, coldest pit of her stomach. She ruthlessly locked it away. Tears built absolutely nothing. She moved slowly deeper into the cavernous dining room, forcing her strained eyes to adjust to the gloomy shadows. She began to inventory the ruin, her dull pencil scratching methodically against the cheap paper. She carefully noted the 24 shattered wooden dining chairs, the 3 horribly warped oak tables, the torn vinyl booths that smelled distinctly of toxic mildew, and the thick layer of raccoon droppings scattered across the peeling linoleum floor. She cataloged the disaster. She stepped behind the curved wooden service counter and pushed heavily against the swinging double doors leading into the back kitchen. The situation back here was much worse. The massive stainless steel prep tables were heavily dented, completely covered in a thick, sticky film of ancient cooking grease and dead insects. 6 massive industrial baking ovens sat completely cold against the grease-stained wall, their heavy iron doors hanging precariously off rusted hinges. Dozens of heavy cardboard delivery boxes, completely consumed by creeping black mold, were stacked in the dark corners, weeping a dark liquid directly onto the cracked floor tiles. It was a complete graveyard. Dorothea walked slowly down the narrow aisle, running her calloused hands over the cold metal of the closest preparation station. The thick grime immediately stained her fingertips pitch black. She did not bother to wipe it away. This horrible grime was hers. This absolute ruin, this suffocating disaster of a building, it all legally belonged to her, and absolutely nobody could ever draft another sneaky legal document to take it away. She just kept writing. She meticulously calculated the hundreds of yards of new copper electrical wiring she would desperately need, the dozens of gallons of harsh industrial bleach required to kill the mold, and the thousands of pounds of rotting debris she would have to physically haul to the county dump. Her lower back ached with a dull, persistent throb. Her throat was incredibly dry, thickly coated in the fine, bitter dust of a forgotten decade. She was entirely alone. Hours slowly bled away into the stifling heat of the late South Carolina afternoon. The temperature inside the unventilated kitchen easily topped 110 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the stagnant dead air into a heavy, suffocating blanket. Sweat poured heavily down Dorothea's wrinkled forehead, painfully stinging her eyes and completely soaking the stiff collar of her cotton dress. She was physically exhausted, trembling slightly from severe dehydration and the overwhelming magnitude of the impossible task ahead. She snapped the notebook shut. For one terrifying moment, the crushing weight of Arthur's cold betrayal threatened to completely break her spirit. The clear image of his smug, perfectly clean face flashed sharply in her tired mind, a cruel phantom mocking her desperate attempt amid the rats and the rot. She stared down at the ruined floor, looking at endless decay, and seriously considered just walking out the back door, getting into her rusted car, and driving blindly until the gas tank ran completely dry. She turned to leave. She was ready to surrender to the darkness, but her tired, aching legs suddenly refused to move. Something was out of place. Her sharp gaze fell directly upon the furthest, darkest corner of the kitchen, a small alcove tucked cleverly behind a collapsed aluminum ventilation shaft. There, hidden from any casual view, sat a massive, inexplicably bulky shape. It was roughly 8 feet long and 5 feet high, tightly covered by a heavy olive-green canvas tarp. The heavy tarp was incredibly thick with gray dust, blending almost perfectly into the deep shadows, but the bottom edges were purposefully secured with thick nylon ropes. It was deliberate. She stepped closer, the broken floor tiles crunching loudly beneath her shoes. As she cautiously closed the final few feet of distance, the overpowering smell of toxic mold and wet rust seemed to faintly, miraculously peel away. It was replaced by an incredibly faint, delicate aroma, lingering stubbornly like a ghost in the hot air. Dorothea stood completely frozen before the massive, hidden shape, her tired heart suddenly pounding violently against her ribs, completely unaware that pulling back this heavy canvas would unleash a storm that...
The heavy, suffocating air of the ruined kitchen seemed to hold its breath as Dorothea gripped the rough edge of the olive-green canvas, her calloused fingers digging deeply into the coarse fabric that had remained completely undisturbed for nearly 3,000 days of absolute silence. She pulled hard. A massive cloud of gray dust violently erupted into the stagnant air, catching the pale shafts of sunlight and swirling like a panicked ghost. The heavy canvas slipped off the bulky shape, pooling onto the filthy floor with a dull, heavy thud. Dorothea stepped back, coughing softly into her sleeve, her eyes watering from the ancient grime. As the thick dust slowly settled, the chaotic ruin of the abandoned kitchen faded away, entirely replaced by the startling sight of absolute, perfect order. It was perfectly preserved. Stacked meticulously against the grease-stained wall were exactly 12 heavy wooden crates, each measuring 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The rough pine wood was dark with age, but entirely untouched by the creeping black mold that had mercilessly devoured the rest of the miserable building. Dorothea reached out with trembling hands. She ran her fingertips over the smooth, splinter-free edge of the top crate, marveling at the incredible craftsmanship that had survived 8 years of absolute neglect. She carefully lifted the heavy wooden lid, the rusted iron hinges groaning softly in the quiet room. Inside, nestled tightly within thick layers of dry, yellowed straw, sat perfectly aligned rows of heavy glass jars. They were pristine. Each jar held exactly 16 ounces of a thick, dark, reddish-brown liquid that caught the faint light and seemed to glow with a deep internal warmth. Dorothea carefully lifted one of the heavy glass containers from its straw nest, gently wiping away a thin layer of dust with her thumb. A faded, yellowed paper label was glued perfectly to the center of the glass. The black ink was heavily faded, worn down by the merciless passage of time and shifting temperatures, but the elegant cursive handwriting was unmistakably clear. Green Fig Jam. Beneath the title, written with a steady, loving hand, was a name that violently shattered the suffocating silence of the decaying kitchen and sent a powerful shockwave straight through Dorothea's chest. Martha Jane Covington. It was her late grandmother. The sudden realization hit her with the staggering force of a physical blow, instantly transporting her mind away from the rotting floorboards and straight back to the sun-drenched, 3-acre farmhouse of her distant childhood. Her grandmother, Martha, had been a woman of iron will and relentless labor, a woman who commanded respect not through loud demands, but through the quiet, undeniable quality of her grueling daily work. Arthur would have laughed. He would have taken one disgusted look at these humble wooden crates and ruthlessly ordered them hauled to the county dump. To a man who worshipped $10,000 watches, offshore bank accounts, and aggressive corporate takeovers, a simple jar of homemade fruit preserves was absolutely worthless. He only understood the sterile, lifeless language of profit margins and ruthless liquidation. He understood absolutely nothing about legacy. Dorothea placed the jar gently back into its nest, her mind racing with 100 silent questions. How had these crates survived here? Why were they hidden so deliberately beneath the collapsed ventilation shaft? She began to systematically unstack the heavy wooden boxes, her aging muscles burning with intense exertion as she moved hundreds of pounds of preserved history, searching for any logical explanation. She reached the very bottom. The 12th crate rested flush against the cracked linoleum floor, completely shielded from the crushing humidity and the ravages of time. When Dorothea lifted this final lid, she did not find more glass jars resting in straw. She found a secret. Resting perfectly in the center of the empty wooden box was a thick, heavy bundle of yellowed paper, completely secured by a tightly knotted piece of rough brown twine. Dorothea reached down, her breath catching sharply in her dry throat, and lifted the fragile package. It felt incredibly heavy. She carefully untied the brittle twine, watching it snap and fall away onto the dusty floor. The bundle contained dozens of meticulously typed documents, ancient purchase orders, handwritten vendor invoices dating back decades, and several stiff, legally embossed certificates. She slowly unfolded the most prominent document. The typed ink was stark and commanding against the aged parchment. Her sharp eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, reading the impossibly complex paragraphs detailing the strict incorporation of a private agricultural trust, the registration of a unique commercial recipe, and the absolute transfer of intellectual property rights. She read the final line. The words sole ownership and direct heir were boldly underlined, permanently binding the legendary culinary creations of Martha Jane Covington exclusively to her only living granddaughter. It was a completely independent asset. Arthur, with all his ruthless corporate spies, his incredibly expensive forensic accountants, and his 18 months of meticulous, venomous planning, had completely missed it. He had stripped her of the sprawling mansion, the millions of dollars in joint savings, and the luxury vehicles, entirely convinced he had left her with absolutely nothing but $21,000 and a broken spirit. He was wrong.
He had left her with the one thing he could never touch, a legal fortress built entirely before she had ever foolishly signed her name onto their marriage certificate. "You missed," she whispered softly, her voice steady and chillingly calm in the empty room. Standing in the suffocating heat of the ruined kitchen, clutching the yellowed inheritance contracts in her grimy hands, Dorothea knew that what she had just unearthed was not merely a sentimental memory of her grandmother, but an incredibly devastating weapon of absolute destruction waiting patiently to be fired.
Dorothea walked into the crisp, heavily air-conditioned office of Margaret with her shoulders pulled back and her spine completely straight. Margaret was 52 years old, a remarkably sharp, incredibly seasoned attorney who possessed cold eyes like cut glass and a terrifying reputation for completely dismantling aggressive corporate lawyers in the courtroom. Dorothea did not bring an expensive leather briefcase. She carried a severely faded canvas bag holding the heavy, brittle stack of yellowed inheritance documents she had pulled directly from the rotting floorboards of the abandoned restaurant. She placed the fragile, dusty papers gently onto the polished mahogany desk. She sat quietly. Margaret carefully adjusted her wire-rimmed reading glasses, her sharp eyes scanning the incredibly dense typewritten paragraphs, the ancient tax stamps, the meticulously dated vendor invoices, and the absolute declarations of sole intellectual property. The room was absolutely silent for nearly 45 minutes. Margaret meticulously cross-referenced the ancient dates against heavy legal volumes, her index finger slowly tracing the faded ink signature of Martha Jane Covington. She examined the notary seals, verifying the exact timeline of the agricultural trust formation. "He missed this," Margaret said flatly. Dorothea simply nodded, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap. Margaret explained with surgical precision that because this private trust and the proprietary recipes were legally established and directly inherited years before the marriage certificate was ever signed, they were completely shielded from Arthur. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on private investigators, aggressive wealth managers, and ruthless attorneys to systematically strip Dorothea of her entire life over 18 agonizing months. He had confidently left her with exactly $21,000, entirely convinced he had won. He was entirely arrogant. "This is an airtight, impenetrable, and wholly independent asset that belongs entirely to you," Margaret stated firmly, handing the documents back. "There is absolutely nothing your ex-husband can do to claim a single penny of this legacy." Dorothea left the quiet, sterile office and drove her rusted, loudly rattling sedan straight back to the 2 acres of overgrown weeds and the rotting restaurant. She did not celebrate. She did not call her former wealthy friends to boast about her hidden leverage or to cry about her sudden luck. She parked the car in the cracked asphalt lot, tied her silver hair back with a piece of rough twine, and unlocked the rusted front doors. She went to work. The grueling process of physically resurrecting the dead structure was a relentless, agonizing punishment on her 68-year-old body. Dorothea hired a gruff, fiercely independent electrician to pull exactly 600 yards of fresh copper wiring through the ceiling, replacing the dangerous, rat-chewed cables that posed a severe fire hazard. She paid him from her rapidly dwindling pile of cash. For almost everything else, she relied entirely upon her own 2 aching hands and her unbreakable will. She was relentless. She purchased heavy industrial sanders, thick breathing masks, steel-toed work boots, and 50 gallons of harsh, toxic chemical bleach. While Arthur was undoubtedly sitting in a plush leather chair in a climate-controlled boardroom, sipping imported sparkling water and admiring his perfectly manicured fingernails, Dorothea was on her hands and knees in the suffocating heat. The temperature inside the unventilated kitchen regularly hit 112 degrees Fahrenheit.
She scrubbed the massive stainless steel prep tables with rough steel wool until her knuckles bled, stripping away thick, stubborn layers of ancient cooking grease, dead insects, and black grime. It hurt terribly. She hauled over 4,000 pounds of rotted wooden debris, collapsed cardboard boxes, shattered vinyl booths, and rusted iron fixtures directly out to the massive steel dumpsters parked in the back alley. Every single muscle in her lower back screamed in violent, continuous agony. Her fingers severely blistered, violently popped, and quickly formed thick, ugly calluses. She spent 3 entire weeks manually sanding hundreds of square feet of warped oak dining tables, inhaling a bitter, suffocating cloud of sawdust as she slowly, stubbornly revealed the beautiful pale wood grain hidden deep beneath 8 years of brutal neglect. She never complained. She purchased 3 massive heavy-duty industrial exhaust fans, working alongside a local handyman to mount them high into the ceiling to forcefully pull the suffocating, stagnant heat out of the dark kitchen. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the 4,000-square-foot monument to absolute failure began to completely transform. The overwhelming smell of toxic mildew and feral animal droppings was entirely replaced by the sharp, aggressively clean scent of strong bleach, fresh lemon oil, and freshly sanded pine timber. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Loretta walked through the newly polished front doors. Loretta was a fiercely principled, incredibly tough woman with cold brown eyes who had spent over 3 decades running high-volume commercial kitchens. She tolerated absolutely no nonsense from anyone, possessing a rigid backbone built from years of harsh restaurant labor. Dorothea interviewed her sitting at one of the freshly sanded oak tables, offering her the position of general manager with a firm, unyielding handshake. "I demand absolute discipline," Dorothea said quietly. Loretta looked directly at the spotless stainless steel shining in the back, the perfectly organized dry storage racks, and the intense, unflinching gaze of the older woman sitting calmly across from her. Loretta simply nodded her head once, instantly recognizing a fellow survivor. She knew a woman who understood that true, lasting order was built entirely through blood and sweat, never through empty, arrogant promises. Loretta immediately took full charge of hiring the front waitstaff, enforcing incredibly strict guidelines for rigid punctuality, immaculate cleanliness, and quiet, absolute efficiency. They built an army. The fragile, hard-won peace of the newly sanitized kitchen was violently interrupted 3 days later by the shrill, piercing ring of Dorothea's old cellular phone. The cracked digital screen flashed a name that instantly made Dorothea's blood run completely cold in her veins. It was Vivian, her daughter, the exact same daughter who had secretly, enthusiastically fed Arthur every single tiny detail of Dorothea's daily routines during the ruthless 18 months of their hidden divorce process. She had smiled warmly directly to her mother's face while repeatedly, willingly holding the knife directly to her back. "How are you holding up?" Vivian asked sweetly. The fake, heavily manufactured empathy in her voice was incredibly thick, dripping with a sickening sweetness that barely masked her true, highly venomous intentions. Vivian asked overly casual, seemingly innocent questions about the useless commercial property, probing desperately to find out if Dorothea had discovered anything valuable. She was aggressively fishing for any tiny shred of actionable information she could immediately report back to her rich father. She desperately wanted to know if Dorothea had finally given up and begged for financial help. "I am working," Dorothea replied calmly. She did not scream at the treacherous traitor. She did not cry, wail, or demand pathetic apologies for the horrible, deeply personal betrayal that had completely shattered their family. She sat completely still on a wooden stool in the kitchen, her voice entirely flat, cold, and utterly devoid of any vulnerable emotion. Vivian pressed much harder, nervously asking about old legal documents, asking if Margaret was secretly plotting a financial retaliation.
Dorothea simply stared at the heavy iron doors of the freshly cleaned industrial ovens. "Goodbye, Vivian," Dorothea said softly. She ended the call. She walked across the kitchen and dropped the plastic phone straight into the heavy plastic trash can. She would absolutely not allow that toxic, manipulative poison back into her meticulously ordered sanctuary. Dorothea tied a heavy, stiff canvas apron tightly around her waist. She walked over to the 6 massive industrial ovens, turning the heavy metal knobs until the pilot lights flared violently into bright blue life. She set the internal temperature precisely to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. She hauled a sack of raw, unrefined sugar onto the shining prep table, her aged shoulders groaning heavily under the immense weight. She unpacked massive boxes of fresh, perfectly ripe green figs, carefully slicing them into exact, uniform quarters with a razor-sharp steel blade. She was resurrecting the ghost. She followed the faded, typewritten instructions of Martha Jane Covington with absolute, unwavering religious devotion. She poured gallons of heavily filtered water into massive copper kettles, bringing the liquid to a rolling, furious boil. She added the thousands of cut figs, the heavy pounds of sugar, and the secret, complex blend of aromatic spices. She stirred the incredibly heavy, thick mixture continuously with a massive hand-carved wooden paddle. The large kitchen quickly filled with an intoxicating, overwhelmingly powerful aroma. The dense scent of sweet caramelized sugar, warm vanilla, and roasted fruit pushed violently.
The man in the impeccably tailored gray suit did not look at the violently peeling exterior paint or the heavily rusted window frames. He looked directly at the massive copper kettles bubbling furiously behind the swinging wooden doors. He inhaled deeply. His name was Nathaniel Reed, a quietly powerful tycoon who had built a massive, highly respected empire of artisanal southern food markets spanning over 800 miles from Charleston to Savannah. Nathaniel had spent nearly 3 agonizing years utilizing incredibly expensive private investigators, digging through ancient, dust-covered county archives and chasing endless dead ends to track down the legendary culinary ghost of Martha Jane Covington. He had tasted the green fig jam exactly once at an exclusive closed-door charity dinner in Atlanta, an experience that had completely haunted his highly refined palate ever since. The trail had vanished completely, until today, when a rogue county clerk casually mentioned a rusted, abandoned restaurant sitting on 2 acres of worthless dirt, currently being resurrected by an incredibly stubborn, silver-haired woman holding an airtight agricultural trust. Nathaniel slowly approached the heavy wooden service counter, his expensive leather shoes entirely silent against the newly sanded pine floorboards. He removed his wide-brimmed felt hat, holding it respectfully against his chest as he introduced himself to the exhausted, sweat-drenched woman wearing the stiff, heavily stained canvas apron. "I have been searching for that exact aroma for 36 months. He stated warmly. To a man like Nathaniel, the dozen heavy wooden crates hidden in the back room were absolutely not merely jars of preserved fruit. They represented an incredibly rare, historically significant narrative that the modern, highly saturated culinary market fiercely desired but could never artificially replicate. The absolute, deafening absence of the brand for over 8 long years had successfully created a ravenous, desperate demand among high-end buyers. Scarcity was absolute power. The most valuable asset in the sweltering room was not the hundreds of pounds of thick sugar or the thousands of perfectly ripe green figs. It was the living, breathing, fiercely resilient heir who held the absolute, indisputable legal rights to the entire legacy. He did not insult Dorothea by offering to buy her out for a pitiful, heavily taxed lump sum of cash.
Nathaniel clearly understood the immense, unbreakable pride radiating from the calloused, severely blistered hands and the perfectly straight spine of the older woman standing silently before him. He pulled a thick, cleanly printed legal proposal from his tailored jacket pocket, laying the heavy document gently onto the smooth wooden counter. It was a genuine partnership. You retain 100% ownership of the brand name, the proprietary recipes, and the historical legacy, he explained clearly. He offered to immediately absorb the crushing financial burden of heavy industrial production infrastructure. He would provide unrestricted access to a massive 60,000 square foot packaging facility located just 45 miles north of the county line. His incredibly efficient corporate team would handle the impossibly complex web of interstate distribution, the aggressive nationwide retail marketing campaigns, and the heavily regulated federal food safety compliances. Dorothea would simply maintain absolute, unquestioned creative control, ensuring every single batch met the uncompromising, rigorous standards of her late grandmother. She was entirely in command. Dorothea looked down at the incredibly generous, deeply respectful legal contract resting on the counter. Her sharp mind instantly flashed back to Arthur. She remembered his cold, dead eyes as he systematically erased her entire existence for 18 agonizing months. She remembered him handing her exactly $21,000, delivering a highly calculated, violently cruel insult designed to break her spirit completely. Arthur had entirely viewed her as a completely disposable, heavily depreciating asset, a useless burden that desperately needed to be aggressively liquidated to make room for his massive, uncontrollable ego. Nathaniel saw a titan. A profound, incredibly powerful wave of absolute validation washed slowly over her tired, aching body like a sudden, heavy thunderstorm after a brutally long, suffocating summer drought. Her immense personal worth was undeniable, officially recognized by a powerful titan of the industry who completely bowed to her newly resurrected authority and her raw, untamed grit. She did not smile widely. She absolutely did not shed a single weak tear of emotional joy. Dorothea calmly reached for the dull yellow pencil resting near the cash register. She carefully read every single word, carefully crossed out a minor termination clause on page 4, and confidently signed her full name at the bottom of the parchment. "We have a binding agreement," she said steadily. The massive, historically significant partnership was quietly sealed in the sweltering 110-degree Fahrenheit heat of the old restaurant. Dorothea and the fiercely loyal Loretta immediately began drastically scaling up their daily operations. They ordered thousands of pounds of fresh local produce, incredibly heavy pallets of sterilized glass jars, and miles of heavy shipping tape to successfully meet Nathaniel's incredibly aggressive, highly demanding nationwide launch schedule. The dark, abandoned kitchen was fully alive, humming continuously with the massive, unstoppable energy of pure creation. The ancient empire was rising. But the heavy scent of massive, newly minted wealth is completely impossible to hide from a highly motivated, incredibly ruthless predator. 300 miles away, sitting arrogantly behind a massive glass desk overlooking the glittering city skyline, Arthur Calloway received a highly confidential, heavily encrypted email containing the explosive financial projections for the upcoming nationwide jam distribution. His cold eyes narrowed sharply. The massive, multi-million-dollar partnership had just barely begun to aggressively bloom when the cold-blooded, meticulously groomed ex-husband caught the powerful scent of the immense fortune, immediately lifting his heavy desk phone to aggressively launch a violently venomous legal strike that Arthur Calloway did not believe in sudden miracles. He believed entirely in aggressive, hostile asset reclamation.
Sitting 300 miles away in his heavily air-conditioned high-rise office suite, he reviewed the highly confidential financial projections with a vicious, cold calculation. The numbers were absolutely staggering. The projected nationwide revenue for the first 18 months of distribution easily exceeded $12 million. He was absolutely enraged. He immediately dialed his ruthlessly expensive legal team, barking aggressive orders into the heavy plastic receiver. He weaponized the pathetic, groveling intelligence his daughter Vivian had desperately gathered during her deceptive phone calls before Dorothea had abruptly severed all communication. Vivian had foolishly recorded their early conversations, documenting the hidden boxes and the ancient inheritance documents. Arthur took those heavily manipulated transcripts and immediately filed a massive, incredibly aggressive emergency injunction in the federal court. His argument was entirely built on toxic, manipulative lies. He legally claimed that the massive commercial value of the heavily protected agricultural trust had only miraculously materialized during the immediate aftermath of their brutal divorce. He aggressively accused Dorothea of deliberately and maliciously concealing massive marital assets, demanding an immediate 50% stake in the entire newly formed corporate partnership. It was a classic, brutally predictable tactic of total financial attrition. Margaret drove the 45 miles back down to the rotting, sweltering county of Willow Creek. She carried a 3-inch thick manila envelope containing the heavy, terrifying legal injunction. She found Dorothea standing entirely calm in the back office of the restaurant, meticulously reviewing heavy purchase orders for 2,000 pounds of refined white sugar. "He wants to bleed you completely dry," Margaret warned sharply. She explained the violent, exhausting nature of his legal strategy. Arthur planned to drag the agonizing dispute through endless appellate courts, burying Dorothea in hundreds of thousands of dollars of crushing legal fees until her spirit finally broke. He wanted to force her to sell her grandmother's priceless legacy to him for mere pennies just to survive the grueling onslaught. Dorothea did not tremble. She did not drop the heavy clipboard onto the floor. She did not scream furiously at the heavily stained ceiling or curse the miserable, suffocating unfairness of the universe. She simply placed the dull yellow pencil carefully onto the smooth wooden desk. "Let him try," she said quietly. She turned away from the heavy bags of sugar and walked directly over to her small, incredibly cheap plastic printer sitting in the dusty corner of the office. Dorothea had not been entirely blind to her treacherous daughter's deceit. Long before she had violently tossed the cellular phone into the heavy plastic trash can, she had meticulously backed up every single manipulative text message, every single heavily calculated voicemail, and every digital footprint of Vivian acting as a corporate spy for her wealthy father. She pressed the glowing green button. The cheap plastic printer whirred to life, loudly spitting out dozens of crisp white pages. Dorothea stood perfectly still, calmly collecting the damning evidence of their pathetic, coordinated betrayal. She placed the printed messages directly next to the original yellowed trust documents signed by Martha Jane Covington decades before Arthur had ever existed. She was building a fortress. She spent exactly 4 hours organizing the thick stack of papers, placing them into a heavy dark blue leather binder. Every single page was perfectly aligned, every single date meticulously highlighted with a bright yellow marker. She was not preparing for a loud, messy argument. She was preparing for an absolute, undeniable execution of justice. She handed the heavy binder to her ruthless attorney. Margaret opened the dark blue cover, her sharp eyes scanning the meticulously organized timeline of undeniable facts and treacherous lies. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile crept across the face of the seasoned lawyer. She recognized the undeniable power of a woman who completely refused to play the victim. "I will see him in court," she stated firmly.
The heavy legal battle lines were clearly drawn. 3 weeks later, the morning sun beat down heavily upon the concrete steps of the federal courthouse, pushing the temperature rapidly toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur Calloway stepped confidently out of a massive black luxury vehicle, his perfectly tailored navy suit completely immaculate, his leather briefcase gleaming under the bright light. He brought a condescending, deeply arrogant smile into the courtroom, completely blind to the absolute death sentence for his ruthless greed had already been prepared.
The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swang open. Arthur Calloway strode down the center aisle with the supreme, suffocating arrogance of a man entirely accustomed to bending the universe to his exact will. He wore an immaculate, custom-tailored navy suit, a perfectly knotted regimental silk tie, and a pair of polished leather shoes that cost more than most people earned in 3 months of grueling labor. He sat heavily at the plaintiff's table, opening his gold-clasped briefcase with a sharp, arrogant snap. He did not even look at his former wife of 32 years. He viewed her as prey. Dorothea sat perfectly straight at the defense table. She wore a simple, pressed gray cotton dress purchased from a discount rack for $24. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe, completely unadorned knot. Her weathered hands, permanently stained and heavily calloused from hundreds of hours of brutally scraping ancient grease and lifting 50-pound sacks of raw sugar, rested quietly on the polished mahogany table. She did not fidget. She was an immovable mountain. The honorable federal judge, a stern woman in her late 50s with incredibly sharp, unyielding eyes, took her elevated seat behind the heavy wooden bench. She did not offer pleasantries. She immediately opened the thick, dark blue leather binder that Margaret had meticulously prepared. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The temperature held at a crisp, heavily air-conditioned 68 degrees Fahrenheit, yet Arthur began to subtly sweat beneath his expensive wool collar. "Mr. Calloway," the judge stated flatly, her voice echoing coldly against the high plaster ceiling. She looked down at the perfectly preserved yellowed parchment of the Agricultural Trust. She read the exact date of incorporation, a date securely stamped into federal law nearly a full decade before Arthur had ever met Dorothea. She meticulously traced the unbroken, entirely independent lineage of the intellectual property, noting the absolute absence of any joint financial commingling. The legal boundaries were a massive, impenetrable iron wall. "You are claiming an asset you did not build," the judge declared firmly. Arthur leaned forward aggressively, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. His highly paid, ruthless corporate attorney immediately stood up, attempting to launch into a heavily rehearsed, venomous speech about implied marital contributions and the supposed shared value of the newly formed commercial distribution contracts. He wildly gestured toward the massive profit projections, desperately trying to blur the ironclad lines of the law. The judge slammed her wooden gavel. The loud, incredibly violent crack echoed like a gunshot through the massive room. She completely silenced the arrogant lawyer, pointing directly at the undeniable, heavily highlighted pages proving the absolute independence of the Martha Jane Covington legacy. She systematically dismantled every single pathetic argument Arthur presented, exposing his legal filing as a completely malicious, highly frivolous attempt at hostile financial extortion. "This petition is completely baseless and entirely dismissed with extreme prejudice," she announced coldly. Arthur sat perfectly still, his jaw completely locked in furious disbelief. He had lost. The brutal, highly poetic justice of the universe did not arrive with loud, hysterical screaming or desperate, chaotic violence. It arrived with the quiet, devastating finality of a single legal signature.
But the absolute destruction of Arthur Calloway did not stop at the edge of the judge's bench. The karma he had so recklessly invited was a massive, incredibly heavy freight train moving at terrifying speed. Margaret had not simply submitted the inheritance documents to the federal court. In order to definitively prove that Arthur had systematically and maliciously hidden his own massive wealth during the 18 months of their brutal divorce, Margaret had officially entered his heavily audited corporate tax returns into the permanent, highly public legal record. She ruthlessly laid his entire financial empire completely bare beneath the blinding fluorescent lights of the justice system. She exposed the precise, incredibly calculated maneuvers he used to hide millions of dollars while tossing Dorothea exactly $21,000 to survive. It was a fatal mistake for him. Sitting right there in the third row of the quiet gallery were two federal financial prosecutors, men in cheap gray suits who had been quietly tracking Arthur's suspicious offshore wire transfers for nearly 3 years. By aggressively dragging his financial history into the open court to steal his ex-wife's newly resurrected jam empire, he had voluntarily handed the federal government the exact, heavily detailed blueprints to his illegal shell companies. His greed was his absolute downfall. Before Arthur even managed to stand up from his leather chair, the news heavily breached the impenetrable walls of the courthouse. The federal prosecutors officially filed a massive 70-page indictment outlining dozens of severe wire fraud violations. Within exactly 45 minutes, two of his largest institutional investors, terrified by the sudden massive legal exposure, instantly withdrew nearly $80 million of critical funding from his primary holding company. His massive, perfectly constructed illusion of untouchable power shattered into thousands of completely useless pieces. His empire violently crumbled. The crushing waves of truth violently rippled outward, directly striking the treacherous daughter who had so eagerly played the role of a corporate spy. The detailed, highly manipulative text messages Vivian had sent, meticulously printed by Dorothea and attached to the public court filings to prove the timeline of Arthur's harassment, were suddenly fully exposed to the public record. Her husband read every single word. He saw the absolute cold-blooded malice of a woman who enthusiastically pushed her own aging mother out onto the street. He saw the exact, highly specific updates Vivian had fed to Arthur regarding the 8 years of abandoned property and the secret recipes. Horrified by the profound darkness residing within his own marriage, he immediately packed Vivian's expensive designer clothing into cheap black garbage bags, tossing them aggressively onto the concrete driveway of their sprawling suburban estate. He locked the heavy front doors permanently. She was completely exiled. Arthur slowly stood up from the heavy wooden table, his incredibly expensive navy suit suddenly looking completely hollow, draped over a severely broken man. He did not look smug. He did not aggressively adjust his silk tie. He looked entirely like a man who had just watched his entire arrogant life violently evaporate into thin air, utterly destroyed by the exact same legal system he had used as a weapon for over 32 years. He walked out in absolute disgrace. Dorothea did not smile a triumphant, highly vindictive smile. She did not gloat or shout insulting words at the pathetic, crumbling figure of her former husband. She calmly picked up her faded canvas bag, her heavily calloused hands entirely steady, and walked out of the heavily air-conditioned courtroom into the blistering 95-degree Fahrenheit South Carolina heat. She did not look back at the shattered remains of the people who had tried to erase her. The crushing weight was permanently gone. She stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, completely free from the toxic shadows of her past, walking slowly toward her rusted sedan to return to the newly resurrected restaurant, where an entirely unexpected, completely beautiful gift was patiently waiting to welcome her.
The morning of the grand opening arrived with a gentle, perfectly crisp 75-degree Fahrenheit breeze sweeping softly through the towering ancient oak trees. Over 400 eager people stood patiently on the cracked concrete sidewalk, forming a massive, incredibly dense line that stretched nearly 300 yards down the quiet, dusty county road. They had driven dozens of miles across state lines just to taste the resurrected legend they had read about in the national papers. The violently peeling exterior paint was entirely gone, completely replaced by a warm, inviting coat of fresh ivory white. The heavily rusted iron hinges had been completely stripped and heavily oiled. The shattered, completely opaque windows were entirely transparent and whole. The ghost was alive. Inside the sprawling 4,000-square-foot dining room, the late afternoon sun poured beautifully through the massive, perfectly clean glass panes. The warm, golden light cascaded gently over the meticulously sanded oak tables, brilliantly illuminating the smooth, splinter-free wood grain that Dorothea had painstakingly revealed with her own severely blistered, violently aching hands. Placed exactly in the center of every single polished wooden table sat a heavy, pristine 16-ounce glass of thick, dark reddish-brown green fig jam. The unmistakable, deeply intoxicating aroma of caramelized raw sugar, freshly roasted fruit, and warm vanilla completely filled the cool, newly ventilated air. Right by the heavy front doors, hanging perfectly straight upon the cleanly painted wall, was a simple, framed black and white photograph. Martha Jane Covington smiled. The massive restaurant was completely packed with joyful, loudly chattering customers ordering hundreds of pounds of heavily seasoned Southern food. Nobody sitting comfortably in the newly upholstered vinyl booths or laughing happily at the heavy wooden service counter knew the agonizing, incredibly brutal history of the silver-haired woman who had painstakingly rebuilt this peaceful sanctuary. They did not know about the ruthless 18 months of aggressive corporate sabotage, the incredibly cold betrayal of a greedy daughter, or the pathetic, meticulously dressed man who was currently facing decades behind heavy iron bars in a federal prison. They absolutely did not need to know that Dorothea had once been brutally shoved out into the blistering heat with exactly $21,000 to her name. She kept her silence. Dorothea stood entirely still at the threshold of the swinging wooden kitchen doors. She wore a completely spotless, stiff canvas apron wrapped tightly around her waist, her bright silver hair pulled neatly back with a simple piece of brown twine, her heavily calloused, permanently scarred hands resting calmly at her sides. She watched the incredible, vibrant life aggressively flooding into the exact same physical space that had been entirely dead and rotting for 8 agonizingly long years. She felt the solid, undeniable weight of her own absolute, hard-won independence, a profound, deeply unshakable peace built entirely from dirt, relentless sweat, and unyielding stoic labor. The once forgotten, heavily decaying ruin now glowed brilliantly with a fierce, undeniable warmth. It stood firmly as a permanent, highly immovable monument to a profound, enduring truth that the arrogant, cleanly manicured predators of the corporate world could absolutely never comprehend. Your absolute greatest value does not exist in the easily stolen, highly fragile paper banknotes that a cold-blooded thief can aggressively strip away. It exists entirely in the monumental, breathing legacy you are incredibly resilient enough to slowly, methodically pull back from the cold, dead ashes.